True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Brenda and Dennis Bowman last saw their daughter Andrea on March 11th, 1989. Dennis was the one who called the police when Andrea went missing that afternoon. He told them that he had come home and found Andrea missing. He said that Andrea, 14 years old and adopted as an infant, was a troubled teen who fought with her mother and had run away before. When Brenda came home, she told the police that Andrea had stolen $150. So this was enough for the police to get a warrant to arrest Andrea, and Dennis was listed as the victim of Andrea's crime. Join us at the quiet end for The Lost Daughter. For decades, Andrea's case was classified as a runaway. Then her biological mother began her own investigation, learning the stories of Andrea's peers and those of similar women and girls who were victims of sexual assaults and murders. What they discovered was a much more complex and haunting story, which would lead them back to Andrea's adopted father, Dennis Bowman. And here's my handsome husband, Richard, with a beer review.
So we got a nice Michigan beer called M43. I can only assume that's named after our road.
Oh, okay.
Don't they all start with M's?
Oh gosh, I've got to admit I'm an idiot when it comes to geography and directions. So.
Well, anyway, yeah. M43 is the beer. It's a New England IPA from Old Nation Brewing Company in Williamstown, Michigan. It's a hazy apricot color, small white head, nice lacing, has a very fruity aroma, both citrus fruit and some tropical fruit, a little bit of pine, taste of mango and grapefruit, late pininess. Is that a word? We'll use it.
You
Pininess.
can make it a word, sure.
It's a pretty smooth beer. New England IPAs are typically more fruity than hoppy.
Which I prefer.
Which you prefer. And this one did its job. Very good beer.
Okay. Well, we've been to Williamstown for the beer, and we enjoyed it, right?
We
nice
have.
Little town.
Yep, driving from our son's house to your parents' house.
That's right. Making the rounds is what we were doing. Okay, well, open it up, Dickie. I am a thirsty woman.
Let's do it.
All right. Why don't you start us out with this story? I heard about this story first by watching a documentary on Netflix called Into the Fire, The Lost Daughter. And it just really had an effect on me. It was fascinating. It was disturbing. I was enraged. I was brought to tears. So I was really kind of adamant that we cover it. And I'm happy that we're covering it today.
Yeah, some of your anger comes through.
In the notes. Yeah, it's in my notes. But I'm sure a lot of our listeners will agree with me.
Oh, yeah. So Andrea Bowman, whose birth name was Alexis Miranda Badger, was adopted by Brenda and Dennis Bowman when she was 9 months of age. Brenda and Dennis met while she was in high school. He was her first boyfriend. When she graduated from high school, Dennis was in the Navy. So they got married in 1971, and Dennis was stationed in San Diego. They lived there for 6 months. Then Dennis was allowed to choose where he would be stationed next. So that they then moved to Norfolk, Virginia, and immediately tried to start a family. But when Brenda did not become pregnant, she went to the doctor, and the doctor told her that her chances of getting pregnant were not good due to a bicornuate uterus.
Yeah,
now that's where a uterus is more heart-shaped than pear-shaped.
Well, and I have to say I've examined a woman with that kind of uterus, and I felt 2 cervixes, which was really freaky.
Yeah, so that does happen sometimes. It's not a consistent thing with a bicornuate uterus, but it does happen.
So how does that interfere with becoming pregnant?
Well, it's almost like you have a cleft in a uterus, so it's tough to, maybe not to get pregnant, but to carry a pregnancy to term.
Oh, that makes sense, sure. Okay, so, not to be a bitch, but maybe it would have been better if she never had any children. Once we get to talking about Brenda, people will understand why I say that.
They probably will.
They probably will. So after that, the Bowmans started working toward adopting a child, and it took 2 to 3 years, but then Brenda got the call that there was a 9-month-old baby girl available for them to adopt. Andrea was a sweet little girl, and the extended family all really loved her. Brenda and Dennis eventually moved from Virginia back to the town of Hamilton in western Michigan. Hamilton had a population of just over 3,000 people located near Holland, Michigan. Nothing bad ever happened in Hamilton. It had a lot of churches, like one gas station, a couple of schools, and a grocery store. So really small. And everyone there, pretty much 100%, were Christian and went to church every Sunday. In fact, if you didn't go along with that, you'd be looked at as kind of weird or as an outcast, which is really very old school to think about.
Yeah.
But of course, Brenda and Dennis did fit in there. They were very religious and they went to church every Sunday. And they were both Sunday school teachers and they wanted to grow their family. When Andrea was 13 years old, Brenda found out that she'd gotten pregnant. And Brenda ended up giving birth to another daughter who they named Vanessa. And Andrea really loved her little sister, loved to help take care of her, just thought this was the greatest thing ever. Andrea entered high school shortly after her little sister was born. And in high school, Andrea was a pretty good kid, just an average student, but not a big troublemaker, and had quite a few friends. So now let's talk about Andrea's biological mom, Kathy Turganian. She grew up as one of 6 children. Her stepfather was in the Navy, and the family moved 7 times by the time she was in the 7th grade. The stepfather was deployed for extended periods of time, leaving Kathy's mother to care for all of those kids, including one who had epilepsy. So she was really on her own a lot, and Kathy was molested by the husband of one of her mother's friends when she was just 10 years old. Then when Kathy was 12, a teenager raped her. So obviously unhappy with her life, but unsure what to do, she's just a kid, she would end up running away. So in 1972, Kathy left Virginia with really just the clothes on her back. She was 14 with no money and no one to turn to for help. She hitchhiked to Tennessee, met up with a friend in Memphis, and took a Greyhound with no destination really in mind. But on the bus, she met a young woman who told her about the Mardi Gras down in New Orleans. The next day, she found herself in the Big Easy, listening to jazz through the French Quarter and partying with a lot of adults. So this was the 1970s, and Kathy was not the only runaway teenager in New Orleans. She met up with a group of other young people who helped each other to stay off the streets. In this group, she met Randy Badger, a 19-year-old who'd hitchhiked to Louisiana from Los Angeles. So they found a place to live together and spent all of their time together. They both were able to find some work at a circus sideshow, and Kathy thought that this was the life she wanted to be living. She was, it wasn't probably the perfect life, but she didn't have to worry about being molested or raped or beaten.
Yeah, well, and also consider that she was just 14.
Well, of course,
so
yeah.
At 14, it might be the life she wanted to be living.
Yeah, but that wouldn't last, of course.
Right.
So in December of 1972, Kathy and Randy traveled to North Carolina. It was legal for minors to marry if they had their parents' permission. So Kathy's parents did not hesitate to give Kathy their permission. In fact, they were actually in favor of the marriage. For them, it was one less person to worry about. Once Kathy was married, Randy would be the person the police would call if Kathy got into trouble. So it made her mom feel like she was kind of off the hook, and her stepfather signed the necessary forms, and that was it. But Kathy and Randy were married for less than 1 year when Kathy was pregnant. Now, it wasn't expected, but to her it was another way that she could feel like an adult. And she wanted to do better with this baby than her mother had done with her and her siblings. So Kathy was excited to be a mother. In June of 1974, Kathy gave birth to her daughter Alexis, who she named after the actor Alexis Smith. But, as you might expect, her relationship with Randy soon fell apart.
Yeah, it turns out that Randy was more interested in hanging out with the bros and drinking and having a good time, chasing after other women. He liked that better than being a husband or father.
Well, he was only 20.
Well, that's still pretty young, isn't it?
Yeah, yes.
Then when Alexis was 5 months old, Kathy came home from work one day and found Randy with another woman on the couch while Alexis was crying in the back bedroom, alone and neglected. So Kathy knew that she had to leave, but her options were slim, and so for the sake of her baby, she decided to return to Virginia and live with her mother.
Which means she must have been pretty desperate.
I can only imagine how desperate she must have been.
Her mother was not the greatest.
Nope.
And that whole circumstance there was bad. So she found herself in a really tough place. But one thing I'll say about Kathy is she's tough.
Yeah,
This is a tough woman, yeah. So whatever confidence Kathy had built up as a mother and responsible adult really left when she arrived in Norfolk, and her mother Shirley showed them no love and no encouragement. She soon learned that Shirley had been diagnosed with breast cancer and had a poor prognosis, and Shirley expected Kathy to care for her and her younger siblings. Even though her mother never told her outright, she did make it clear that she didn't think that Kathy should have a child of her own, which, might be true, but the child's already here.
Yeah.
So what good does it do to make her feel bad? Right. Then one day Shirley told Kathy that they were out of baby formula and said, "Hey, how do you plan to take care of this kid?" Made her feel bad. Kathy's doubts about whether she could properly care for Alexis were growing, and then she did begin to consider adoption, which her mom was really promoting and thought that was her best option. So Shirley told Kathy it would be the best thing for Alexis and oversaw the details of handing Alexis over to Catholic Charities. So, of course, she was telling Kathy this will be the best thing. She'll have a wonderful life with a nice family. But that's not always true.
No, it isn't. But it's a lot of work. Have a single mother without a husband to help out. And you're living at home with your mother, who is not very motherly.
Oh, yeah.
Even under the best of circumstances, it's a tough thing to do. So
exactly.
Adoption, I think, is a pretty viable option.
Oh, sure. I'm just saying it's not always perfect.
Oh, no.
And in this case, it certainly wasn't. But we know that Kathy was doing it for the right reasons, of course. So, of course, putting her daughter up for adoption, though, was heartbreaking. She was very bonded to her. But she assured herself that she was giving her daughter the best possible life. A short time after the adoption, Kathy left her mother's home again, and she would eventually go to nursing school and meet her husband, who she would be with for many, many years. Kathy and her husband never had any children together, and she would spend the next 30 years having no idea where her daughter was. So Kathy hoped her daughter was happy and would one day want to find her biological parents. So a quick break here to let our listeners know how they can support the show and get benefits as a subscriber. If you're new to the show, you may not know that we have a premium TCB show with early, ad-free, and bonus shows for our supporters. And we send all new members a gift, some TCB swag, and a thank you note. So if this is something that interests you, go to tygrabber.com/subscribe. Other ways we ask you to support the show is if you can give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. That's very helpful. And we'd love to get your emails and voicemails. You can send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tygrabber.com. And voicemails can be sent by clicking on the voicemail link in our show notes or on the little doodad on our website. However you support us, even if it's just being here listening, we very much appreciate you.
So Kathy was living her life, but she never stopped thinking about her daughter, Alexis. And then in April 2010, kind of out of the blue, she received a letter from a social worker who explained that Alexis had disappeared from her adopted home back in 1989 in Michigan. Kathy was living in Massachusetts with her husband at this time. So Alexis, or Andrea, had been considered a runaway, but now the police were following a new lead. They thought that Andrea might be a Jane Doe who was found dead in Wisconsin, and the police were asking for a sample of Kathy's DNA to compare and find out if this Jane Doe was her daughter.
So this was a real shock for Kathy to get this letter.
Oh, it must have been incredible.
It's been like 20 years.
It's 20 years.
Kathy was confused because the letter gave her very few facts about what had happened. The letter did not include Alexis's adopted name or even the city where she'd lived. So they also didn't give her any contact information for the police, and they didn't give any details about her disappearance that had happened when she was 14 years old. And this was the same age that Kathy had been when she'd run away from home. But now a Jane Doe had been found dead next to a cornfield, and the police thought it might be Kathy's daughter. Kathy did want to give her DNA to help out with this, so she did, and she was told that she'd have to wait some time for results. It wasn't going to happen quickly. But like you said, at this point, she'd been missing for 21 years. So Kathy gives her DNA. She's got this letter. But now she's like, well, now what am I going to do? I've got all these emotions and thoughts. What do I do with them? She didn't feel like she could just wait around for the DNA results. So she did contact the police and the adoption agency, but neither could tell her daughter's adopted name or even where she had disappeared from. Because this had been a closed adoption, Kathy really had no standing or rights to any of this information. So Kathy decided, well, fuck it. I'm going to find out on my own where my daughter is. What happened to her, at least. And all she had was a birth date. Of course, she knew the birth date. She was her mom. So she asked her husband, Eddie, who was the more computer savvy one at that point, although I think Kathy did learn a lot over the next few years, to look on the internet for a missing child close to her daughter Alexis's birthday. Eddie said he was only searching for about 10 minutes when he found a missing girl with the same birth date as Kathy's daughter, June 23rd, 1974. And actually, she was the first person listed on the missing persons section for the Michigan State Police. Now, Kathy didn't recognize her right off, of course, because she'd been a baby when she'd last seen her. But as soon as I looked at her face, especially around the eyes, I thought, oh my God, she looks a lot like Kathy. Did you get that feeling too?
Yeah, I did.
The eyes. They both had these big, beautiful eyes. So Kathy did soon learn that Andrea had ended up in Virginia's Department of Social Services as a baby. Someone, probably her mother Shirley, had reported that Alexis was born with fetal alcohol syndrome and that Kathy had taken LSD during her pregnancy. And Kathy is adamant that these are lies. So she realized the life that she had wished for her daughter had never happened. They learned that her name had been changed to Andrea Michelle Bowman and that she had lived in Hamilton, Michigan when she disappeared back in March of 1989. So desperate to find out more, Kathy decided to create a Find Andrea Bowman page on Facebook and on Classmates.com. She knew that kids who knew each other from high school might go looking for each other on these websites, and she really hoped to hear from some of her daughter's peers. And it really worked.
Sure did. A bunch of messages pretty soon started coming in. Sue Engweiler, who's a relative of Andrea's, contacted Kathy as soon as she found the page. Brenda Bowman is Sue Engweiler's cousin, and they went to the same school together in Muskegon, Michigan. She described Brenda as quiet, a girl who kept to herself a lot. Dennis was her first and probably only boyfriend.
Yeah, I've got nothing nice to say about Brenda.
I know. So when Andrea disappeared, she was in high school. She had a cute short haircut. She liked to dance to 1980s music. Think Cyndi Lauper and Madonna. She was sociable and funny, but she seemed to have a difficult life.
Yeah, her home life was far from ideal. She actually dealt with similar things to her own mother, which was heartbreaking for Kathy because she'd done the adoption to give her daughter a better life. And her daughter kind of ended up in a worse situation, you'd have to say.
Yes.
So Kathy soon heard from a guy named Carl Kopelman, and they began exchanging messages and eventually talking on the phone. So Carl Kopelman was a professional accountant and an unpaid volunteer forensic sketch artist. And since 2009, Kopelman has drawn over 250 face sketches and age progressions of missing and unidentified people. So Kopelman has said that growing up in the 1970s, when there was growing news coverage of serial killers, had started his fascination with solving crimes. He's pointed to incidents in his youth as some of his formative memories. The first happened when he was just 9, during the 1972 Summer Olympics, when terrorists killed 11 Israeli athletes. The next thing he remembered happening was in 1977, when he was 14. A friend of Kopelman's brother, 17-year-old John LeMay, was killed by the trash bag killer Patrick Kearney. And the third notable incident didn't directly impact Kopelman's life, but it was a notable experience for him. This was in 1979 when he was 16, and 16-year-old Lucinda Lynn Schaefer was killed by the Toolbox Killers in neighboring Redondo Beach, California. So Kopelman did really become interested in crime and forensics, and in August 2009, after the safe return of abducted child J.C. Dugard, he was really digging into it. Kopelman was sitting in his mother's home on the computer looking at online news articles about that case. And he began to look at the Web Sleuth's website and found himself really gravitating to the forums for missing and unidentified people. Over time, he progressed from reading the discussions to participating in them. And eventually he was spending up to 12 hours a day searching for leads from sources like old yearbooks and classmates.com. So I think it's probably safe to say he was a bit obsessed. This became his hobby.
Well, I have this picture of this kind of guy who doesn't hold a job and he's at home living with his mother and he's on the computer all day.
I don't think that's the case, Dickie, because he was a good accountant and he actually had a lot of skills with, Excel and making up spreadsheets. So I don't have any information that would make me think he had trouble holding a job. But even if that's the case, he was good at this. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I just was looking at the picture that it printed in my brain.
Sure.
Which doesn't work well sometimes.
Well, no. You're making assumptions, which is fine. But from what I've read about him, because I did do some additional research on his history, I think he was just really, really obsessed with this. And he ended up being good at it because he has solved crimes.
Yeah.
Maybe he was better at this than accounting. I'll give you that.
Well, they sort of maybe not go together, but, accountants looking at numbers, hard facts.
Exactly.
And that's what he's trying to do.
Very detail-oriented person. Yeah. Yep. So it was while looking through missing person listings that Kopelman identified Andrea Bowman as a strong candidate for being the Racine County Jane Doe. The theory was that Andrea had run away and then had been murdered years later in 1999. So he began to investigate Andrea's disappearance online, and he eventually came across the classmates.com page for Andrea that Kathy had created. So that's how these two ended up meeting. So Kathy had met other online sleuths, but she and Carl Kopelman began working together to solve her daughter's case while she awaited the DNA results. But finding out if it was Andrea's body that was found would be just one piece of the mystery. Because if she had died, how had it happened and when had it happened? If she had been murdered, who had done it? So Kathy contacted Pat O'Reilly, a retired detective in Michigan who was familiar with Andrea's case, and according to Kathy, he told her they botched this case from the beginning. Then Riley told her that the person they needed to be looking at was Andrea's adoptive father, Dennis Bowman. So this is when some light bulbs really were set off.
Well, in botching the case from the beginning, I think that everyone who was involved just thought that she was a runaway.
Absolutely, but I think that the police need to look further into it than that, especially if they'd looked at Bowman's history and that he was the one that reported Andrea missing, which of course we'll get into that more as we get into the case. But I don't think it's okay for the police force to just say she's a runaway. No biggie. She's a 14-year-old child. I don't care if she's a runaway or if she's kidnapped, she's in danger.
Well, that's a different topic.
Yes.
The police would probably be satisfied that she was a runaway if her adoptive parents said, oh, she's done this before, she'll be back.
Well, that's part of the problem, right? Because the adoptive parents were not reliable historians.
Well, as it turns out, they weren't.
As it turns out. Well, that's what I'm saying. You can't just accept what the parents say, because the parents are your first suspects when a child goes missing or dies. Maybe they didn't know that in the 70s, but we know that now.
Oh, you bet we do.
You betcha. So now we're going to talk about an incident that happened in 1980 in Holland, Michigan. This was 9 years before Andrea went missing, so she was just 5 years old at that time. This was a sunny morning in May of 1980, and a 19-year-old young woman was riding her bike north of Holland, Michigan, when a man on a motorcycle ran her off the road. He told her to get off of her bike and walk into the woods. She didn't follow his orders, so he pulled out a gun and fired a shot past her, again telling her to do as he said. She still didn't do it, so he fired the gun again, this time into the ground at her feet, and he told her his next shot would hit her. So this really saved her life, I'm going to say, that she didn't go along with it. And I am of the belief that you never get in the car with a man or walk into the woods or do things like that. If they're telling you to do that, just shoot me right here, because once they get you somewhere on their own, you're doomed.
You are.
Yes. So she did the right thing, very brave, and fortunately just then a car drove by and the man turned his head, and the young woman took that chance to ride away on her bike as fast as she could. So he didn't shoot at her or chase after her, and she was able to flag down someone in a pickup truck who gave her a ride home. When she got home and told her parents what had happened, they called the police, and the young woman gave a description of the man, a white male with tinted glasses and a blue helmet. She said that his motorcycle had a black case mounted on the back of it as well. So that same day, the police were able to find and detain a suspect. And the young woman immediately confirmed that he was the man who had tried to attack her. It was Dennis Bowman, who was married and had his adopted daughter, Andrea, at home.
This is pretty quick police work.
Yeah.
I mean, the same day.
This is impressive. Yep, but she had a good description, so she really was very helpful. Dennis was convicted of assault with intent to commit criminal sexual assault. He was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. He was ordered to have psychiatric counseling, and the judge decided that he would pose a danger to women if he were ever set free. Still, Bowman only served the minimum sentence.
So Dennis's wife, who was also Andrea's adopted mother, name is Brenda, stood by him. She stood by him again in 1998. That year, a state trooper in Dorr, Michigan, responded to an alarm at the mobile home of 28-year-old Vicky Vandenbrink. She had reported so many break-ins that the sheriff's department had installed a security system. And this time, when the trooper arrived, he found Dennis Bowman walking away from her back door. So it turns out the Bowmans had moved to Hamilton, which is a town between Holland and Dorr, in 1989, which was shortly after Andrea went missing. Dennis Bowman told the trooper that he was temporarily staying with Vicky, who was a former co-worker of his. So he was let go. But when the police contacted Vicky, she said that he was lying. So after that, Dennis changed the story, telling the police that he had entered her trailer to use her bathroom. He had been there at least once before, he claimed, when his daughter wanted to sell Girl Scout cookies to Vicky. So the police didn't believe his story. Oh, it is kind of leaky, isn't it?
Very leaky, and I'm glad they didn't believe it.
So they asked for his permission to search his property, and he agreed. In the loft of an outbuilding, they found a duffel bag filled with lingerie, a shotgun, a black shirt, a black sweatshirt, and a mask. And the lingerie was identified as belonging to Vicky Vanderbrink.
Right, so it's just a shame this guy wasn't stopped right then, or sooner, obviously. Bowman pled guilty to 1 count of breaking and entering. In his sentencing memo written by his attorney, it does not mention the 1980 conviction or the prior break-ins reported by Vicky Vanderbrink. His attorney presented letters to the court written on Bowman's behalf by his counselor who ran his sex offender group treatment program, his boss, and a member of his church. The church member wrote that Dennis had taught Sunday school to kindergartners for the past 6 years. And the court was also given a letter from Brenda, who again defended her husband. Now, I don't know if I'm dense, but why would being a Sunday school teacher make it any less likely that you're a sexual predator?
Well, you're looking at kind of the facts, you know?
Yeah.
And in this area of Michigan, if you go to church regularly, or if you teach Sunday school, you're good. You're with God. And you couldn't have possibly done all those horrible things they're accusing you of.
No, because there was no such thing as hypocrisy there.
See?
Yeah. So, Dennis Bowman made a statement also saying that he was a happily married man for 28 years. And you know what? He said he had 2 daughters, but did not mention that his older daughter, Andrea, had been missing for over a decade. That just never came up for some crazy reason.
Well, whoever was questioning didn't follow up on that.
No. So Kathy Turkanian only learned the details of Dennis Bowman's criminal record after she submitted a Freedom of Information Act request. Based on what Detective O'Reilly had told Kathy, she knew that they needed to look into his past. When she read about what he had done to at least 2 women, Kathy felt that the truth was Dennis Bowman had killed her daughter. So Andrea and Racine Jane Doe had similar physical characteristics, and Holland, where Andrea disappeared, is directly across from Lake Michigan, where Jane Doe was found. It's only 4 hours by car from one location to the other. Now, I know when we talked about this, you thought, well, that's really not that close.
Well, it isn't.
Right.
I mean, as a crow flies, it's close,
Sure.
but there's a lot of water.
Yes.
So you got to drive south, then across, then north.
Right. But I guess, because they were of similar age and had some similar features, this was thought to, be a possibility.
Oh, yeah, I would definitely see that.
Yeah. But the DNA test came back in 2013, and Kathy was not related to the Racine County Jane Doe. Jane Doe was then identified as Peggy Johnson, a 19-year-old who was assumed to be a runaway. Peggy was last seen at a homecoming dance in Harvard, Illinois in 1994. An aunt was worried enough about her to take out a classified ad in the newspaper, but no one seemed to think something terrible had happened to her. Peggy had disappeared a short time after her own mother died. She did not have a father at home, so she found herself homeless with a developmental disability that made it really hard for her to get a job and work a job. So she met a nurse, Linda LaRoe, who offered her a job as a live-in housekeeper and a nanny for her kids. But over the next 5 years, LaRoe would abuse Peggy. She beat her, starved her, and made her live in a crawl space. In 1999, at age 23, Peggy was murdered by LaRoe. When Peggy's body was found, no one could identify her. But then 20 years after Peggy's death, the police got a tip about a nurse who had confessed to killing someone who worked for her in the late 1990s. So in November 2019, Peggy Johnson's body was finally identified, and LaRoe was arrested.
I wonder what prompted her confession.
Well, it wasn't a confession like, I'm going to go to prison. It was like maybe they were having drinks and she said, I killed someone back then. How sometimes these people do.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, some people maybe are proud of it or they want to get it off their conscience. I'm not sure what the case is with this woman, but she was clearly a monster.
I think so.
So Kathy was relieved that her daughter was not this Jane Doe, but she also felt certain now that Dennis Bowman had killed Andrea. Kopelman was as obsessive in his detective work as Kathy was in getting justice for her daughter. But Kopelman was calculated and logical, while Kathy was impassioned and not afraid one bit to show her anger. So once she had Bowman's criminal record, she began writing posts accusing Bowman of killing Andrea.
Yeah, she's doing a bit of a reach here to finger him as the killer.
Okay, but I also think that she had an intuition, which,
You go back to what you said. She was impassioned and intuitive.
Absolutely, because even though it wasn't her fault, there had to be some guilt that you put your child up for adoption and this happened, because, as a parent, there's always guilt. But why don't you tell us about that Missing in Michigan conference, because that's a good story.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
So this was September of 2013. In September of 2013, Kathy met Carl Kopelman in person at the Missing in Michigan conference. This conference is a way for the Michigan police to raise awareness and hopefully get leads on cold cases. Friends and family members met in East Lansing for panels, support groups, and DNA collection, which could help identify remains and match them to missing family members. Kathy and Kopelman showed up in T-shirts that read, "Find Andrea Bowman." So as Kopelman and Kathy were sitting in on a morning group therapy session, Kopelman nudged Kathy and pointed out that Brenda and Vanessa Bowman were there. Now, Vanessa's the child they had together.
Yeah, they had her when Andrea was 13.
Right. So Brenda and Vanessa recognized Kathy, Turkanian too, and knew what she had been posting about Dennis on Facebook.
Well, good.
So when it was Brenda's turn to introduce herself, she told everyone, "We have a little situation here."
Oh, fuck her. Come on.
Then she looked at Kathy and said, "I see that you very much resemble Andrea."
Oh, how did she not punch her fucking face?
That's got to be raising a red flag at her.
Ugh. Yeah, because you say that she's reaching a little, but you have to remember, if you see this record of what he's done, and then he's the one that reported his teenage daughter missing, and we're going to get into the fact that she had said he was abusing her, it kind of makes sense that he killed her.
It does.
So Brenda tried to continue talking, but Kathy was furious, and she cut in. She turned to Brenda and said, "Tell the truth, Brenda. Tell them about your husband." So when that drama subsided, the session continued. Then afterwards, Kopelman approached Brenda. She wanted to tell him her side of the story. She said that she and Dennis had fully cooperated with the police after Andrea went missing. She also told him about sightings of Andrea after that day. So she was talking as if she still believed that Andrea had run away, although I don't buy it. Then Kopelman brought up Dennis's criminal record, and Brenda said, "I haven't forgotten what he did, but I do forgive him. I take my marriage vows very seriously." Oh my God. So Kathy couldn't hold back any longer after overhearing this, and she yelled, "Tell us how you abused, starved, and humiliated her, Brenda." Then Brenda's daughter Vanessa broke in to defend her mother. "You need to be put into an insane asylum," she yelled at Kathy. So things were tense. For the remainder of the conference, the women avoided each other.
That's a good thing.
But I would have loved to have been there for that.
Yeah, there were some fireworks.
Absolutely. After the conference, Kathy and Carl Kopelman decided that they needed a private investigator in Michigan who could work on Andrea's case. So Kathy hired Jeffrey Floor, a former Michigan State trooper who had helped to solve a gang rape and murder from 1979. Floor got Andrea's police case file, which Kathy and Kopelman had not yet seen. And some of the documents were from before Andrea's disappearance, 4 months beforehand. So here's where we get a little more information. It was 4 months before Andrea disappeared when police first responded to allegations of child abuse in the Bowman house. The report did not have details of what had happened, but it noted that the allegations were not true. And one thing became very clear. The police had mishandled the investigation of these allegations and of Andrea's disappearance, because it was obvious at this point that the police had missed a lot of things, some kind of obvious things.
So Kathy and Kopelman found people who Andrea had confided in and people who had witnessed her being mistreated at home. Jennifer Jones was one of these friends. They were in the middle school band, and they both played musical instruments. They were close in their freshman year of high school as well. So one Tuesday afternoon, Andrea came home with Jennifer, but when it was time for her to leave, she said she didn't want to go. And according to Jennifer, Andrea said that her father was sexually abusing her. So Jennifer's mother let her spend the night, and the next day she took her to the principal's office. There, Andrea told school officials about the abuse. Jennifer was sent back to class and assured that the adults would handle it. So Andrea was not in her classes for the remainder of that day. So Jennifer assumed that she was in protective custody or foster care. But later, she learned that Andrea had been sent back home with Dennis and Brenda.
Now, how much does that piss you off?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
So the principal had brought Dennis and Brenda into the school and questioned them in the office. Brenda told the principal that Andrea lied. Dennis said that she lied all the time. So what could Andrea do with her parents right there? So she said, "Yeah, I made it all up."
So obviously that's not the proper way to handle that, and I hope they've corrected that. But if a child says they're being abused, especially sexually abused, really, and then you bring the parents in and ask them right in front of her, that's not the right kind of investigation that needs to be done.
No, not at all.
And make her go right home with them? That's horrible. So around the same time, Andrea confided in Jennifer and her mother, and she also confided in, around the same time when Andrea confided in Jennifer and her mother, she also confided in Arlene Ron, who was another mom in town. Andrea had befriended Ron's sons in the church youth group, and then she had begun spending time at their house. Eventually, Andrea got comfortable enough that she told Ron that her father was abusing her. She also told her that Brenda knew about the sexual abuse but did not care. Ron was hesitant to get involved for some reason, so she told Andrea to talk to the pastor. So, passing the buck. And when you go to counseling with a pastor, it's not real counseling. I'm sorry. You don't want that kind of a counselor, especially when he has a relationship with her parents.
Yeah, you need a neutral party.
Absolutely, and probably someone who's trained in that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That goes without saying.
Then, on an evening when she pulled into the Bowman's driveway to drop off Andrea, Dennis came out front and told her to stay out of his business. But Ron never reported any of this to the police or the school. And then within a few months, Andrea was gone. So a lot of adults let her down.
Yeah, and there were many people that had a bad feeling about Dennis Bowman.
Yes.
One couple who had grown up with the Bowmans in Muskegon knew about his criminal record and remembered him bragging about his sexual conquests as far back as high school. Now, this couple had always felt uncomfortable around him, and they kept an eye on their daughter whenever he was around. And they ended their friendship with the Bowmans. When their daughter found the Facebook page for Andrea, she said that her parents had never been contacted or interviewed by police. And it wasn't until Kathy contacted the couple that they spoke to anyone about their suspicions.
Yeah, so more adults who did not go to the police. Should the police have gone to them? Yes, they probably should have been canvassing everyone who was friends with the family. But that not being done, why didn't this couple go to the police and let them know about their concerns? It's just very disturbing in how many things could have been done that maybe could have prevented this, or at least could have helped solve it sooner.
You're right.
So here's another story that's just bone-chilling. When a young woman named Meta McLeod saw the Facebook page that Kathy had created, she contacted her about something that had happened to her as a child that she felt could be connected to Andrea's disappearance. So this had happened on a September afternoon in 1989 when Meta was only 6 years old. As she was walking to a friend's house, she was waved over by a man in a red truck who promised to take her to see some puppies. He told her that her mother said it was okay for her to go with him, and then he just pretty much grabbed her and put her into the truck. Now remember, she's 6, so she's really helpless. Yeah. So as they drove into a rural area, Meta kept asking if they were there yet. But when they came to a 4-way stop, there was a police cruiser beside them, and the man told her to get down in the seat and hide. So he had seemed like a nice guy at first, but once he pulled over into a woodsy area with her, his whole demeanor changed. He pulled off the road, parked the truck, and dragged her into some thick brush, holding her by her neck. Then he tore off her sweater and wrapped it around her mouth. Then he tied her hands behind her back with rope and took off the rest of her clothing. As he knelt over her and unzipped his pants, Meta heard a dog barking nearby. Fortunately, the man was spooked by this, probably realizing that there were people nearby with the dog, and he ran off. Meta ran naked and barefoot to the main road to get help, and 2 cars pulled over and 911 was called. So the police did go to Meta's home that evening, and a sketch artist made a sketch of the perpetrator and of his truck. This man's face looked a lot like Dennis Bowman, and she said that the man smelled like grease or paint. Well, Kopelman found out that Dennis had been working at the harbor as a carpenter right down the road when Meta was abducted, and Bowman had also owned a red pickup with a white cap on the back. But the police did not find their suspect back in 1989. The case went cold, and then the statute of limitations eventually expired. As Meta got older, it really haunted her to think that the man could be victimizing other little girls. And when she came across the Find Andrea Facebook page, the similarities to her attack were significant to her. Then, when she looked up a family picture of the Bowmans, and she saw Dennis Bowman's face, she was shocked because that was the man who had abducted her the same year that Andrea had gone missing. It was Dennis Bowman.
What a shock that must have been for Meta.
Oh, can you imagine?
To look at that and say, holy shit, that's the guy who did it.
Well, just living with that must have been hard. I hope she got counseling. But then to find that out, yeah.
So after speaking with Meta, Kathy Turkanian and Carl Kopelman were convinced that Dennis Bowman was a serial predator who had killed Andrea and covered it up by saying she had run away. But still, there's no proof at that point that Andrea was murdered, or even that she was dead. But still, Kathy became convinced that he had buried Andrea in his backyard. It's horrifying to realize that the adopted father of her daughter had probably raped and killed her.
Yeah, that's an understatement, I would say. So talking with Andrea's extended family members and friends from her childhood, Kathy found out that Andrea was mistreated by her adoptive parents. They had stories of Andrea being treated like she was less than in her own home, and stories of Dennis yelling at her, chasing after her, and hitting her. One friend said that when the family had hamburgers one night, Andrea was only allowed what they called a leftover sandwich, which was bread with mustard, ketchup, and relish on it. And when she told a friend about this in front of Dennis, he stood up and hit her so hard that Andrea fell out of her chair. So, how would that be? You're visiting a little friend and the father does that. Holy shit.
Yeah.
So Andrea's friends encouraged her to leave home, but Andrea really loved her baby sister, and she didn't want to leave Vanessa there by herself. I mean, Vanessa could have started getting abused as well.
Oh, sure could have.
So she was kind of looking out for her little sister in that she didn't leave sooner, which is incredibly sad. Then in the immediate time after Andrea's disappearance, there were some people in the community who reported sightings of her. But the police investigation was pretty much nothing. According to Brenda, Dennis had picked up Andrea from school that day, and when they got home, she said, Andrea was very quiet. Dennis then drove Brenda to work with the baby Vanessa in their car. Then Dennis said that he had come home and Andrea was gone. He said she had taken some money, a travel bag, and her purple coat. He said he looked around for her and then he called the police.
After Andrea was missing, Brenda said they borrowed other people's cars and went into Holland in the evenings to look for her, but they never found any clues to her whereabouts. There were tips and sightings of Andrea at a roller skating rink, at a grocery store, and working in the adult entertainment industry. So the general belief at that time, which was encouraged by Dennis, was that Andrea had run away. Dennis told the police that Andrea had been using drugs, been stealing, and just generally getting into trouble. So clearly a way to make it look like she was a delinquent who had run away. And the police didn't even look for her.
No, but it was another crime committed by Dennis Bowman that would finally bring to light what really happened to Andrea. This happened back in 1980 in Norfolk, Virginia. On the evening of September 9, 1980, Vivian Mahoney, a friend of 25-year-old Kathleen O'Brien Doyle, visited Kathleen at her house. She was there at about 7:30 p.m. and they each had a glass of wine and talked. Mahoney would later tell police that she had left Kathleen's house between 9 and 9:30 p.m. The next day, September 10th, Vivian Mahoney tried to call Kathleen several times, but didn't get an answer. The next day, September 11th, Mahoney and her husband James decided to stop by and check on Kathleen because she still wasn't answering her phone. So a little after noon on the 11th, James drove them to the Doyle house. When James parked the car, Viviana got out and walked up to the door. She noticed that the outdoor light was on, there was mail in the mailbox, 2 newspapers were on the ground, and the screen door was unlocked, which was unusual. Vivian looked through the small windows in the door and could see their 2 wine glasses from September 9th still sitting in the living room. So when she went to knock on the door, it opened. It wasn't shut all the way. Vivian walked into Kathleen's house and looked around the living room, and everything was like they had left it on the night of the 9th. When she walked into the bedroom, though, she found Kathleen on the floor. Vivian ran out of the house and yelled to James that Kathleen was on her bedroom floor and she thought she was dead. James then ran into the bedroom, and he later told the police that the room was in disarray with the mattress moved from its normal position. The room looked like there had been a struggle in there. He told police that he saw Kathleen lying on the floor with various cords wrapped around her. He had checked for a pulse, but there was none. There was dried blood, which indicated that she had been killed some time ago. Neither of the Mahoneys had touched anything in the bedroom other than to check for a pulse. So James told Vivian to call the police, but the phone wasn't working. And it was later determined that the internal mouthpiece of the phone had been removed, preventing a caller from being able to communicate. And when I think of that, I just think of that asshole Bowman thinking he was so clever. So James ran next door and called 911. The Norfolk police and the fire department responded to the house. Kathleen was declared dead. She was naked, her hands were bound behind her, she was gagged, and she had an extension cord around her neck. Her body was in full rigor, and she was cool to the touch. There was dried, matted, whitish material in her genital area, and it was noted to possibly be semen. In Kathleen's autopsy, It reads that the death resulted from homicide and that she showed signs of sexual abuse with punching and blunt force injuries to her face, kicking to her stomach, and strangulation with an electrical cord. There was also a burn mark on her that was about the size of a cigar, but may have come from a burnt Lincoln log because they did find a Lincoln log that had one end burned, and Kathleen did not have any children. Kathleen had also been stabbed in the back, and there was a second stab wound in the front that had hit one of her ribs. Swabs were taken from her vagina and cervix, which each had the presence of sperm. Her formal cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation by strangulation and stab wounds with internal hemorrhage. No weapon was located which could have been used in the stabbing. They never located the mouthpiece to the phone either. Phone records showed that Kathleen's mother had tried to call her at 11 p.m. on September 9th, but Kathleen had not answered. So that makes us think that something happened to her between when her friend left at 9 or 9:30 and when her mom tried to call her at 11. So Kathleen's husband was never a suspect because he was away with the U.S. Navy. No leads were developed, but the Norfolk police continued to investigate. And through the 1980s and 1990s, the family of Kathleen, especially her father, really advocated for further investigation. With new forensic science of DNA analysis, Norfolk Police Department homicide detective Scott Halverson started trying to locate all of the witnesses, family contacts, military contacts, and any other persons of interest, and getting DNA samples from them. Then in 2001, homicide detective Donnie Norrell reviewed all of the evidence and found that the green print bedspread that was found beneath the victim had never been submitted for DNA analysis. So in July 2001, a DNA profile was identified on the bedspread. The police department worked with Kathleen's father, Captain O'Brien, to get more leads and obtain DNA samples to eliminate sources throughout the United States.
So all samples were eliminated, and there was no positive match found in the DNA data bank. In a report written in 2019 by Parabon's Snapshot Genetic Genealogy report provided information about their analysis of the DNA extracted from the bedspread and searched national sources to find similar genetic information. That November, Parabon provided ancestry prediction and potential extended family lineage to the sample, which consisted of more than 30 potential kinship relations. Norfolk Police Department cold case detective John Smith attended a training seminar that November, which was also attended by members of the Michigan State Police Department. So during a conversation between Smith and some MSP detectives, the detectives said they were familiar with Dennis Bowman, who was one of the persons with potential kinship to the DNA sample reported by Parabon. Very interesting. The MSP detectives also said they did have a DNA sample from Dennis Bowman.
Yeah, so this is particularly interesting because it's kind of a coincidence that they ended up meeting like that at that point in time. But it turned out that Bowman's DNA profile was consistent with the DNA profile from the bedspread found beneath Kathleen Doyle. A murder warrant was then obtained on November 20th, 2019, and Dennis Bowman was finally taken into custody 2 days later in Allegan County, Michigan. His wife Brenda complained that Dennis couldn't have done it because they were living in Michigan in 1980. So on February 7th, 2020, he was extradited to Norfolk, and at that time a sample obtained from a drinking cup was taken from Bowman and submitted to the forensic lab. The report confirmed that Bowman could not be eliminated as a contributor to the swabs from Kathleen Doyle's body. The probability of randomly selecting a person who would be included as a contributor is 1 in greater than 7.2 billion people, which is approximately the population of the entire world. So I'd say that's pretty strong evidence.
It is.
Bowman was read his rights and interviewed by Detective Smith, and he admitted to entering the home, but he said it was to steal, and he'd entered through a back window. He actually was able to just kind of overlook and bypass all of the violent details of the attack and claimed he just accidentally came across her in the home and accidentally stabbed her one time. Records show that Bowman was in Norfolk at the time of the murder for a 2-week active drill with the U.S. Navy. And kudos to Detective Smith, who sat there with this awful human being and spoke to him for hours and treated him like he was just another person. Actually acted respectful and kind to him for the most part, which I think would be impossible for many of us. I never understand how they do it, but of course I appreciate it. So reading about the Michigan case in May of 1980, where Bowman had tried to get that 19-year-old woman into a secluded area and had fired 2 shots near her, detectives thought that he must have been in jail for that offense at the time. But the trial transcript from September 16th says that Bowman was not there because he was on that 2-week drill in Norfolk, Virginia. So then they knew he was in Norfolk when Kathleen was murdered.
In June 2020, Dennis Bowman took a plea deal where he admitted to the burglary, rape, and murder in Norfolk. So if you watch the interview with John Smith and Bowman, it's quite creepy. And you can see that he's a disgusting manipulator who does this self-pity routine. You know, poor me.
Oh, so gross. Like talking about his mother and yada yada. Ew. Yeah, he's really bad. And then the police also brought in Brenda, and she was her awful self, I'm afraid. When told that Dennis confessed to Kathleen's murder in Virginia, she still said that there is always hope that he didn't really do it. Then she also was not ready to think about what he could have done to Andrea. I quite honestly think she knew damn well about the sexual abuse of Andrea, and that he had to be behind her going missing. But his known criminal history and the fact that his daughter is missing and he was the one to report her missing should have really knocked some sense into Brenda, but nope, it didn't. So I really think she didn't honestly care about the people that Dennis harmed or killed. For both Dennis and Brenda, it was all about their own needs. It's just icky. So Brenda had lived with him for those 30 years when Andrea was missing. So how did she not have any idea? In that docuseries I mentioned, Into the Fire, they show a video call between the two of them, Brenda and Dennis, after his confession, where they kind of flirt, and they talk about him sending her flowers and how that made them cry. She even said that after he got out of prison years ago, they should have gone to counseling and gotten to the bottom of everything. So this definitely refers to the things he did to his daughter and other females, and Brenda stuck by him in spite of all of it. On their call while he's in jail, she says, "I love you, even though I damn you at times," and then she giggles. He says, "I don't blame you a bit. I should be at home and I'm not." So nothing at all about the people that he has hurt, just all about how they feel, which I find really gross. It's just upsetting that she's not held responsible at all for any of this. She was responsible for Andrea. She was supposed to be her mother. She knew she was being molested by her husband, but chose to do nothing about it. Then, when Andrea went missing, while at home with only him, she had to have had some idea that something had happened to her. But it doesn't matter, because even after he confesses, she will forgive him over and over again. So disgusting. Brenda has proof and still talks to him and jokes with him afterwards. So the police, knowing that Dennis really wanted Brenda's support, came up with a plan to tell him if he told them where they could find Andrea's body, he could stay in Michigan, where Brenda would be able to visit him in prison, because Brenda lives in Michigan. So in his mind, if he knows he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison, then he would rather spend that time in Michigan. So they made a tentative offer to Bowman that if he agreed to be honest about Andrea, he could stay in a Michigan prison. Still, he was difficult and very stubborn. Brenda said he couldn't stay in state because he couldn't confess to something he didn't do. They even got his daughter Vanessa involved, and the three of them were on a call joking about the police searching the Bowman's property. But the detectives began putting pressure on Dennis Bowman about Andrea. He was spinning his own tale, but he would eventually start bargaining. The detectives were able to set up an in-person meeting between Brenda and Dennis that was supervised by 2 detectives.
So when Dennis was brought out to the room to meet with Brenda, he said to the detectives, "I hope you have your cameras rolling." Then he confessed to Brenda, but of course he didn't tell the whole truth. he told her that Andrea had been dead from the start. And in this version, he said he came home and went upstairs and saw Andrea coming out of their bedroom. He said that Andrea told him that she was leaving. And he said, "No, you're not going anywhere." Then he says that Andrea threatened to make up a story to the counselors that he had been molesting her. He said, "No, you're not," and he hit her. Then he says she fell backwards down the stairs. So his story now is that she accidentally died and he covered it up. He said she wasn't breathing, and her neck felt bad, and he didn't know what to do. But Brenda doesn't tell him to bug her off. She stays there and cries with a SOB.
Yeah, and he went on to say that he wrapped her in a blanket, hid her in the barn, and reported her missing. Then he says he couldn't fit her body in this cardboard barrel he found, so he had to cut her legs off. Can you imagine? He says he put the barrel out front in the neighbor's trash after that. And still Brenda stays and talks to him. Unfucking believable. He actually says as long as he didn't tell her, there was hope for Brenda, like he did her some kind of a favor.
Come on.
I know. Whole story was bullshit. He chopped her up. There's no getting around that. And he actually spoke as if some of it was Andrea's fault. So the police had a warrant out for Andrea's arrest when he killed her because he told the police that she had stolen money from them. He really shows no remorse at all. He actually says, "Just because she broke her neck doesn't mean I didn't love her." And Brenda continued to defend him and continued to quote the Bible to her murdering husband. Brenda just chose to believe him because that's what she wanted to believe, I guess. It's really difficult to understand. But now the police still wanted Andrea's remains, and they weren't believing his story of putting her out with the trash. They were monitoring his letters to Brenda, of course, and he was continuing to contradict his story of what he had done with Andrea's remains. On December 12, 2019, he wrote to Brenda that Andrea did fall and break her neck, but that he didn't put her body in the trash. He went on to say that he buried her in a private cemetery. He said she was wearing her favorite sweater, and that he wrapped her in a clean white sheet, wrapping her hands and feet with a red ribbon. He says she really liked that color. Then he says he put her in a tarp with cedar chips, cloves, and cinnamon. "I'm sure she's with God," he says. Then he claims that he loved her, that he loves Vanessa. Then he claims to love her, Vanessa, and Andrea. So the police used Brenda to get Dennis to tell them where Andrea's remains were. The police met with her at her house and tried to convince her that he owes her to let her know where he left Andrea. So she called him and told him if he helps them find the body, then he can stay in Michigan and they can continue to visit each other. So yes, she still wants to be married to him and visit him.
Yep. Dennis had tried to give Brenda a story that might be marginally acceptable to her, with the whole thing about a cemetery and a white sheet and all that. Then Brenda called him and told him that she didn't care how it happened or what had happened. She will still love him no matter what.
Ugh.
And she wanted him to be in Michigan so she could visit.
Sure.
So he finally agreed to tell them where Andrea's remains were. And Kathy, Andrea's biological mother, had been correct. Dennis had moved Andrea to their new house when they moved after he killed her, and she'd been there the whole time.
Yeah, so the police went out to the house with a bulldozer, and at one point the claw of the bucket picked up the rim of a barrel, and they found Andrea's bones. Brenda was right inside the house at that time. But what did Brenda have to say? She said to a detective, "Well, he didn't lie to me this time." Wow. Just wow. That's what she actually said.
Well, there's something definitely wrong about that lady.
Oh, something seriously wrong with her, yes.
So Andrea's remains were found in 4 different bags in the remnants of the barrel. She was in a trash bag full of dirty diapers.
Yeah, so total bullshit about cinnamon and, oh, God.
Yeah.
This scumbag.
There's a peppermint patty candy wrapper in the trash with her, and it had the date of 1989 on it. So she had never been missing. She'd been in the barrel all along. She was found just where Kathy said she'd be.
Which is pretty amazing, because how many people would kill someone and then dig them up and take them to their new house?
Yeah.
Most of the experts and detectives didn't think that was a thing, but for some reason Kathy felt sure of that. So I think she had a better grasp on who this Dennis Bowman is than the police even did. So when Brenda called Dennis after that, He actually blamed her for his lies because, he said, he was trying to make her feel better. Then she actually says, "I don't want you to be mad." And he says, "At least you'll have her in a tin jar on a shelf." And then she says, "Nothing's changed. I still love you." So these people are so reprehensible. And the autopsy report on Andrea's remains, of course, matched Kathy's DNA. It was her daughter.
Found her. So the police again met with Brenda, and they told her about all of Dennis's confessions to sexual assault and to the 2 murders. Brenda said, "I don't know that man, but the man I do know, I will still stand by him.
Exactly.
He's a serial violent sexual offender. So it's likely that he had victimized and killed women previously."
Oh yeah, I think we've just seen the tip of the iceberg, really.
Yeah, no. Does that mean that they're going to go back and look at his history of where he'd lived and
I think so.
missing women?
I think they might look at where he was at certain times in unsolved cases and do DNA comparisons, yes. So Bowman did plead no contest to second-degree murder of Andrea Bowman, also Alexis Badger, and that's, I think, is what her mother, Kathy, prefers for her to be known as now, is her birth name. He was sentenced to 35 to 50 years in prison. He was not allowed to spend his sentence in Michigan. They weren't going to give him that, thank God. So he was sent to prison in Virginia. The prosecutors did not want to allow him to have that control by allowing him to stay in Michigan, and that's definitely a good thing. Brenda was given Andrea's, Alexis's cremated remains, and she wanted to give half of the ashes to Kathy. Kathy, of course, accepted them, but she was very upset that Brenda kept half of them. So Kathy still wants to get all of her daughter's ashes. But Brenda actually said, and I heard it on a recording, that Kathy should be happy with what she got. And Dennis says, well, it was Kathy who threw her away. Can you imagine these monsters? Can you imagine? Just unbelievable to me.
So Dennis Bowman is serving 2 life sentences in a Virginia prison, but the full extent of his violent crimes may never be known. In October 2024, Kathy created a petition to get the rest of Alexis's remains from Brenda Bowman. You can read it, and if you want, sign it on a Facebook page, Justice for Andrea M. Bowman.
Yeah, I mean, how do you feel about that? About Brenda actually keeping some of the remains? I think it's really kind of nervy. She just doesn't seem to take any responsibility.
Yeah, well, you can also argue that for 14 years or so, she raised the child.
And abused her? And let her be abused? And from what the friends and family said, treated her pretty badly.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying what she would
sure.
likely use as a reason.
Well, yeah, sure.
It's time for listener feedback.
Okay, Dickie, what have we got for feedback? I need a brain cleanser right now.
Okay. Well, we have some interesting stuff here. So before we get into some case suggestions, I have some recent news concerning the Lucy Letby case. An independent panel of specialists, there's like 12 or 14 neonatologists, pediatricians that had met to investigate the Letby conviction. And Dr. Shu Lee was the chairman of this, and he is the co-author of a paper published in 1989 looking at air emboli in patients, and had mentioned that there was some distinctive skin changes associated with air emboli. And this is what Dr. Dewey Evans, who was a witness for the prosecution, kept hitting back on, that there was evidence of this skin discoloration. Now, Dr. Lee had already said that he misinterpreted his findings.
Yeah, I remember that distinctly, yes.
And the response from the courts was that, well, the defense should have presented this at the time, so we're not going to allow it. Anyway, so the panel of specialists has been meeting, and they announced on the 4th of February that they find no evidence that Letby murdered or attempted to murder any of the babies in her care.
That's pretty amazing.
They said that pre-existing conditions were responsible, and errors in the treatment or care that infants received were the problem.
Right, so not specifically by Lucy, but by the doctors, who many were really not qualified for babies that sick. and also the facility. Facility had problems.
Right. So that's exciting. Now, we got to see where that leads.
Well, it has to lead somewhere. She can't just stay in prison with all of this coming out.
Yeah, no, you can't.
So hopefully sooner than later. Because, at this point, I feel like she didn't do anything, and I feel bad for her. I think when we first started looking at it, I was, I could go either way, kind of. But everything we found out since, if she's not innocent, she certainly is not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
Oh, far from it.
Yeah. Okay, so we will continue to keep an eye on that one, and we welcome your opinions on it. Fascinating case. So we received an email from Stacy with a case suggestion. Hi guys, love your pod. It was the first true crime I started listening to. I wanted to ask if you have heard of Lynn Hernan. She was murdered by the daughter of a family friend with tetrahydrozoline, cocaine, and over a period of 2 years, she stole $250,000 from her, and then she stole about $100,000 from her estate after her death. It is fascinating to me, her killer's lack of remorse and constant lies. So, Jesse Krasuski was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Lynn Hernan. She was a friend and caretaker of Hernan, who was in poor health. Krasuski poisoned Hernan with tetrahydrozoline, and this is a common ingredient in over-the-counter eye drops, but can be neurotoxic when ingested orally. So there have been a couple of cases in the past we've read about, I don't know if we've covered them, with murder being done by these eye drops. I remember a woman killing her husband with that.
Yeah, that's one of them. So this woman, Krasuski, put, I think it was 6 little bottles of Visine in the drink.
Wow. See, that's kind of scary to me, too, that it really doesn't take a lot of that to kill you.
I know.
Right? And you can just buy it over the counter.
And you
Scary.
can get it over the counter.
And you really can't taste it.
Nope.
Yeah, and this was all about money, which is really terrible. Because I believe this woman was helping her mother and her, and she just decided, I'm going to kill her. And I think at some point she had stolen so much money that she was going to be in trouble and decided, to kill her. Yeah,
because the victim was not a real wealthy woman. I mean, she had the money that was taken from her.
Right. She was comfortable, but she wasn't rich, no.
No.
Yeah.
And these are supposed to be friends.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. So thank you, Stacy. I would like to cover that. I think I saw 48 hours or Dateline on that, too.
There was a 48 hours on it.
Okay.
On this particular case.
I think we watched that some time back. And then we have another email from Karen with a case suggestion. Why don't you read that one?
Well, Karen says, I'm not great with words, but I found a compelling story that only Jill and Dick could tell.
Well, that's awfully nice.
I'm sure there's others that could tell that story, too.
No, but it's super kind. Thank you, Karen.
So this guy named Anthony Pisano was convicted to serve 300 years in prison for murder. He'll never get out, will he?
No. So this was in Anchorage, Alaska, right?
Yes.
Okay.
He killed 3 men in a gold shop robbery. He was really diabolical and tried to hire a hitman to kill witnesses. He was a former military, and the first trial ended in a mistrial. Pisano was friends of the owners of the gold shop, and he was introduced to them by a member of the police force.
Huh.
Pisano said he killed in self-defense. Check it out. I'll see you at the quiet end.
Okay, so self-defense, that's kind of a long shot.
That's what he took for it.
And the jury did not believe that, apparently, because Pisano got 300 years in prison in the second trial.
Well, he had 2 charges of first-degree murder and 6 charges of relating to the murder. I mean, they had like 10 charges against him.
Well, if you're doing an armed robbery, that makes it felony murder, which is worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, that's another one definitely want to cover. Then we have an email from Tina with a case suggestion, and this is about the murder of Tricia, Jillian, and James Doyle. So October 2004, Christopher Bernard killed his sister and her 2 children. He then tried to kill himself by running onto a busy highway. Whoa. Bernard blamed his actions on his drug addiction, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
Yeah, this is a case in New Hampshire. I remembered it.
It does sound familiar, yeah.
What stood out was that he ran into Interstate 93, which is always a busy road.
Well, sure.
And he got hit and survived.
Wow. So he was, do we know what he was on for drugs? Because it sounds like he's pretty crazy.
Good old OxyContin.
Okay. And her children were minor children?
Her children were 4 years old and 2 years old.
Oh my God. It's so sad. Well, we'll look into that one. It sounds a little heartbreaking, I have to admit to you, Tina, but we will look into it.
All right, let's do that.
Okay. All right, guys. Well, thank you for joining us at the Quiet End today. I hope I wasn't too angry. I hope I didn't swear too much, but this case really got to me. That's all I can say. It really got to me. It certainly did. Wow. And I would love to hear other people's opinions on it and how it affects you. I would suggest you watch the documentary. I think it's on Netflix, right? Into the Fire?
I think so.
Yeah.
But then again, I figure pretty much everything's on Netflix.
Right. One app is just like another.
Yeah.
Okay. But if you enjoy watching true crime documentaries, I would definitely recommend watching it because really affected me. Very emotional story. So we invite you to join us here at the Quiet End again soon. We'll see you next time.
Come on down. Plenty of room.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.